By dawn, the Ardennes forest is no longer quiet, it's boiling. A winter fog sits low over the ridgelines like a lid on a pot, and beneath that lid, on December 16, 1944, thousands of German guns ignite in unison. The first shells land with a rhythm that feels deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if the earth itself is being hammered into submission. Telephone lines snap. Radios turn into static. Couriers race through snow that suddenly seems too deep, too slow, too small for what's coming. American units that believed they were holding a quiet sector wake up inside a storm they cannot yet name. And that is the most dangerous moment in war, the moment when reality changes faster than headquarters can accept it. Because while men on the front are hearing the truth in concussion and screams, far behind them the machinery of command is still running on yesterday's assumptions, maps, estimates, confidence. Hitler has thrown his last punch, not at the strongest part of Allied power, but at its certainty. The question is not only how the Germans broke through, but why Eisenhower's headquarters, after years of hard-won lessons, still underestimated the blow that would cost the United States roughly 75,000 casualties before it finally burned out. To understand the shock, you have to feel how safe the Western Front seemed in late 1944. After Normandy, the Allied armies had raced across France so fast it felt like Germany was collapsing on a timetable, and even when that momentum stalled, the stall looked temporary, not fatal. The big questions at Eisenhower's headquarters and within SHAe weren't, can Hitler still attack? But where do we punch through next, and how soon can we get across the Rhine? The front was wide, the logistics were strained, and the fighting was brutal. Aachen, the Hürtgen forest, the grind toward the Ruhr and Saar proved the Wehrmacht could still bleed you. But those battles reinforced a different belief, that Germany was now fighting defensively, rationing strength, running out of fuel, running out of trained men, running out of time. In that picture, the Ardennes looked like the opposite of an invasion highway. Steep valleys, thick woods, icy roads, and poor supply routes. A place to hold with thinner units, to rest divisions, to rotate battered regiments, to keep pressure on elsewhere while the larger plan matured. And that decision wasn't madness. It was a calculation built from months of experience. The tragedy is that Hitler understood the psychology of that calculation, and chose that exact quiet place to make noise loud enough to shake an entire front. Now listen to the warnings that existed, scattered, imperfect, argued over, and quietly pushed aside by the sheer weight of what headquarters thought it already knew. Intelligence in December 1944 was not blind, but it was conflicted. Some signals and prisoner reports hinted at German movement, some aerial reconnaissance was frustrated by weather, some analysts saw the build-up and asked uncomfortable questions. Others looked at the same fragments and concluded the Germans were simply shifting forces to defend against Allied offensives already underway. Even when pieces looked suspicious, armoured units relocating, radio traffic changing, strange concentrations behind the line, there was always an alternative explanation that fit the comforting narrative. Germany was crumbling, so any movement must be defensive, any reserve must be last-ditch, any concentration must be too weak to matter. And beyond the data was the human filter. By December, Allied staffs had been fighting a war of forecasts for months, predicting German collapse, predicting when fuel would arrive, predicting how fast bridges could be built, predicting when the next river line would break, and the people who make those predictions learn to trust patterns. They learned that German counterattacks had been sharp but limited, local rather than strategic, and that the Wehrmacht lacked the fuel for grand manoeuvres. They also learned that the Ardennes itself punished large operations, so the warning signals didn't land in a vacuum, they landed in a mind already convinced. And that is how underestimation happens at the highest level, not because no one speaks up, but because uncertainty is filed as noise, while certainty is treated like truth. Then the weather became Hitler's accomplice, the one shield the Allies couldn't bomb, and the one advantage German planners could actually rely on. In the West, Allied air power had become a kind of constant pressure, a steel ceiling that punished daylight movement and exposed every supply convoy, every rail yard, every armoured column that dared to breathe. The Germans knew they couldn't win a fair fight under clear skies. They had learned that lesson through Normandy, through the Falaise pocket, through the relentless attacks on bridges and roads that turned retreat into catastrophe. So Hitler's gamble demanded a cloak, and December's Ardennes offered it. Low cloud, freezing fog, short daylight, and a suffocating visibility that turned aircraft into blind giants. Under that cover, German units could assemble closer to the line without being shredded, and their movement looked like the ordinary churn of a front rather than the winding up of a fist. For the Allies, the same weather dulled the sharpest blade in their toolkit. Reconnaissance flights were grounded or useless. Spotter planes couldn't see. Bombers couldn't find targets. And the frontline soldiers, who had grown used to thinking, "At least the planes will come," suddenly faced a terrifying silence overhead. It's hard to overstate what that meant psychologically, because in modern war, air power is not only destruction, it's reassurance. When the skies closed, reassurance vanished. Hitler didn't just hide his build-up, he attacked the Allied sense of control. And when command believes it controls the tempo, it tends to interpret danger as manageable, until the moment control is ripped away. Here's what Hitler was really attempting with that last punch, and why Eisenhower's headquarters struggled to believe it. This wasn't a simple counterattack to gain ground. It was a strategic gamble designed to break the Allied coalition by force and panic. Hitler's concept, brutal, impatient, and almost theatrical, aimed at the one place where Allied strength could become a weakness: dependence on ports, roads, and confidence that the front was stable. If German armour could punch through the thinly held Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and drive to Antwerp, the Allied armies in the north would be split from supplies, the British and Americans would be separated, and the entire Western Front could fracture into confusion. Even if Antwerp remained out of reach, Hitler still sought a victory loud enough to alter politics, to shock public opinion, to force caution, to tempt negotiations, to buy time against the Soviets in the East. That's why he concentrated what remained of German striking power, armoured divisions, elite formations, desperate fuel allotments, into one decisive thrust, betting the Reich's last mobile reserves on speed and surprise. From a purely military standpoint, many German officers thought it was fantasy. From Hitler's standpoint, fantasy was the only remaining currency, and that is precisely why the plan was easy for Allied planners to discount. Headquarters tends to measure the enemy by rational capability: fuel, trucks, manpower, air cover. Hitler measured the war by will and shock, by whether a blow could change the story before it was fully understood. Eisenhower's staff saw a weakened Germany and expected defence. Hitler saw an audience, Allied command, primed to underestimate him, and he chose the one move that punished underestimation most violently: a massed surprise offensive aimed not just at ground, but at belief. December 16th begins not with a dramatic armoured charge you can see coming, but with a kind of controlled violence meant to drown the front in confusion before it can form a coherent answer. In the pre-dawn darkness, the artillery barrage rolls across American positions, and it isn't random. It's targeted at headquarters, crossroads, communications nodes, anywhere that keeps units connected. Then German infantry moves through the woods with rehearsed precision, using the terrain like a weapon, slipping around strongpoints, probing for weak seams, and forcing small American units into isolated fights where bravery can't compensate for being cut off. And because the sector is thinly held, because it was judged a quiet place to rest and refit, those seams exist. The first reports that come in are contradictory. Some say it's a raid, some say a strong local attack, some say the enemy is everywhere. This is the moment a surprise offensive earns its first real victory. It breaks the enemy's narrative before it breaks his line. As the hours pass, German armoured spearheads push into openings, and behind them the road network begins to choke. Refugees, supply trucks, retreating units, staff cars, all competing for narrow, icy routes. Men who expected a winter lull suddenly see columns of tanks where they thought no tank could move, and the speed of the penetration makes the attack feel larger than it is, like a shadow that keeps growing as you try to measure it. By nightfall, it's clear this isn't a local jab. It's a deep strike, and the front is bending in a way that makes every commander ask the same terrifying question. How far back does the problem go, and how quickly can we stop it before it becomes irreversible? Inside Eisenhower's headquarters, what collapses first is not a plan, but a confidence, because the earliest battlefield facts arrive as fragments, and fragments are easy to misread when they contradict your assumptions. At shae, the Supreme Commander's staff is suddenly drowning in reports that don't align. One message says a regiment is holding, the next says the same road is gone. One map still shows a stable line, while the actual line is already bending behind it. Communications are being cut in the very places that would normally clarify the picture, and winter weather slows reconnaissance and movement, turning every update into a late echo of a front that has already changed. Eisenhower is not commanding divisions directly. He is commanding a coalition, a vast machine of armies, supply systems, and political realities, and that machine cannot pivot on rumour. Yet waiting for perfect certainty is its own decision, and in the Ardennes those hours are everything. The chain below him, Bradley's 12th Army Group, Hodges's 1st Army and the scattered corps in the woods, must improvise while higher headquarters tries to determine whether this is the main German effort or a diversion masking something worse elsewhere. This is how underestimation becomes dangerous in real time. The enemy moves with a single purpose, while you are forced to think in multiple possibilities. And while staffs debate scale and intent, German spearheads keep doing the one thing that makes every estimate obsolete, moving forward. At the centre of the storm is Bastogne, and the reason it matters is brutally simple: roads. In the Ardennes, terrain narrows choices until a few junctions become lifelines, and Bastogne sits on a wheel of highways that can feed an advance or strangle it. When German armour starts racing west, the crossroads becomes a hinge. If it falls quickly, the German timetable accelerates. If it holds, the offensive begins to bleed time, fuel, and momentum, the three resources Germany can least afford to waste. American units, rushed in and surrounded, transform Bastogne from a town into a symbol. But the symbol is built on logistics and cold arithmetic. Keep the roads denied, keep the enemy slowed, keep the front from tearing wider. Inside the perimeter, the situation is a study in endurance, ammunition running low, wounded piling up, freezing nights, and a ring of enemy pressure that tests every weak seam. Outside, command wrestles with an ugly truth. To save Bastogne is to admit the breakthrough is serious, and to prioritize it is to reshape the entire Allied response. This is where the underestimation of Hitler's last punch becomes impossible to maintain, because a surrounded crossroads is not a minor inconvenience. It is proof that the enemy has forced you into emergency decisions. And when the Germans demand surrender, the refusal, short, blunt, defiant, becomes famous precisely because it is spoken from the edge of encirclement. Bastogne is not the whole battle, but it becomes the battle's heartbeat. If it stops, the German advance breathes easier. If it keeps beating, Hitler's timetable starts to die. And then comes the pivot, the moment the Allied response stops being a scramble and becomes a counterstroke. And it begins with an audacious decision to turn a massive army in the middle of winter as if it were a single vehicle. Patton, commanding the Third Army, is not sitting in the Ardennes when the attack hits. He's oriented south and east, fighting his own battles, pursuing his own objectives, and yet his mind is already trained to ask the only question that matters in a crisis. Where can I move fastest to change the outcome? What follows is not myth, but operational skill, staff work, logistics, discipline, because you do not simply point divisions north and hope. Roads must be allocated, fuel must be prioritized, Traffic control must be ruthless, units must march in sequence, artillery must be repositioned, and commanders must accept that speed is worth risk. Eisenhower's headquarters, now fully grasping the scale of the threat, needs a dramatic shift in momentum, and Patton offers it. A relief effort aimed at Bastogne that doubles as a statement that the German breakthrough will not be allowed to widen unchecked. In the snow and darkness, columns grind forward, engines straining, men sleeping in foxholes and trucks. The whole movement driven by urgency that feels almost physical. When Patton's lead elements finally break through to the encircled defenders, it is more than a tactical success. It is the offensive's first real wound, because it proves the Allies can still maneuver under shock. Hitler's last punch was designed to split and paralyze. This turn north is designed to stitch and stiffen. It doesn't end the battle, but it changes the story from surprise to response, and in war that shift is often the beginning of defeat for the attacker. When the skies finally clear, the battle changes character almost overnight, because the weapon that had been muted by fog returns with a vengeance, and the German offensive begins to suffocate under the very air power it tried to escape. Allied fighters and bombers surge back into the cold blue, striking columns on exposed roads, hammering bridges and choke points, shredding supply convoys that were already running on a razor-thin margin of fuel. For the Germans, this is catastrophic not just physically but structurally. Their offensive lives on movement, and movement requires gasoline, replacement parts, and roads that stay open long enough for momentum to feed itself. Under air attack, every truck becomes a target, every traffic jam becomes a killing zone, and every detour burns precious fuel they do not have. The same skies also bring relief to the surrounded and battered, airdrops into Bastogne, faster casualty evacuation, the return of that psychological reassurance that the front is not alone. And as the German spearheads slow, the Allied command structure begins to regain its footing, because time is the most valuable commodity a defender can purchase. The longer the offensive drags, the more reserves arrive, the more artillery is massed, the more coherent the counterattacks become, and the more the German thrust turns from a blade into a wedge stuck in frozen ground. Hitler's last punch was meant to be decisive and fast. Once it becomes extended and visible, it becomes vulnerable. From this point, the question is no longer whether the Allies can stop the offensive. They can, and they will, but how much blood, cold, and chaos must be paid before the bulge is finally crushed back into the line.